All right, thanks, Dr. Grau, for inviting me to talk, and to the other governors as well. I plan to present for about 20 minutes and then hopefully leave enough time for questions and discussion. So I'm going to be talking primarily today about a new initiative we did with the University of Pittsburgh residency program this year called Ward Stories. I don't have any conflicts of interest. I do have my standard federal employee disclaimer. And I do also want to give credit where credit is due. I helped come up with the idea for Word Stories, and I've helped facilitate some of the sessions. But it's really our chief resident, Dr. Agonifer, who spent the year at the VA, who really, she was the energy behind Word Stories. She facilitated most of the sessions. She followed up and made sure everyone filled out their evaluations. And she's headed to UCLA to be part of the National Clinician Scholars Program next year. So she did a wonderful job, and she really should be giving this talk. Just to give you a sense of where we're headed, just a few things we're going to cover. We're going to talk briefly about these terms, finite and infinite games, and how they relate to residency training. We're going to talk about what I think are two essential prerequisites for creating a climate of reflection. And then finally, we're going to talk about elements of an effective question or prompt that can lead to effective reflection. So we will start with a case. So JL is an excellent intern nearing the end of his first year. Over the course of 10 days as his ward attending on a busy service, you've been impressed by both his clinical skills and bedside manner. You've been similarly satisfied / impressed by your own teaching during the rotation, which causes the following comment to hit so hard that you will continue to discuss it for years to come. So after concluding post-call rounds towards the end of the rotation, JL says with a sigh, "I just feel like I'm not learning anything." So I will let that sink in for a minute, and you can think to yourselves about whether you've ever had a similar experience. One of my hobbies is poetry, so we're going to have a brief poetic interlude. This is Marie Howe, who grew up in a large Catholic family in Boston. I think she had 7 brothers and sisters, and her youngest brother, who was closest in age to her, died in the mid-90s of HIV. And so this poem is called The Gate. I had no idea that the gate I would step through to finally enter this world would be the space my brother's body made. He was a little taller than me, a young man, but grown, himself by then, done at 28, having folded every sheet, rinsed every glass he would ever rinse under the cold and running water. "This is what you have been waiting for," he used to say to me. And I'd say, "What?" And he'd say, "This," holding up my cheese and mustard sandwich. And I'd say, "What?" And he'd say, "This," sort of looking around. So the novelist and philosopher David Foster Wallace used to tell this story about 2 adolescent fish who were swimming along in their fishbowl one day, and they passed an older fish, and as the older fish swam by, he hollered at them, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the one fish looked at the other fish and said, "What's water?" And he used that story as a jumping off point to talk about attention and attentiveness. And it was his view that the way that we choose to direct our attention is what shapes our reality. And he pointed out that it really is a deliberate choice, that sure, we can fall into habits. We would call that maybe mindlessness. But it really does matter. It matters a lot in medicine how we focus our attention. Are we gonna focus on how much work I have to do for what I see as a silly admission, or are we going to focus on the person in the bed who's probably much more inconvenienced than we are? So I think attention is really important. I think this word intentionality is similarly important, and one reason I bring this up, one of the common problems that the clinician educator group talks about at Pitt is how the med students never seem to understand when they're getting feedback. And the conclusion that we've come to is because we're not labeling it properly. I could sit in the team room and critique an oral presentation for 15 minutes, and I'm not sure the student would understand that that's feedback. So we do a lot of work on framing. Hey, I'm about to give you some formative feedback, and then I think it's received in a different way. So one response that I had to JL was to think first about my clinical teaching and how can I make more of an impression on my learners. And one thing I decided to do was to be very intentional and to say, hey guys, this is what you learned today. And so we have an every other day admitting cycle at the VA, and I can't say I do it every time, but just about every time on a post-call day, I do this is what you learned, and I highlight things particularly that I look up. So they may be things that I'm learning fresh, or they may be things that I have to refresh my memory about. And then I go through the list, and I limit it to 10 things each day. And at the end of the month, I kind of come up with these summary sheets and just say, here's some of the memorable diagnoses we saw. Here are some of the lessons we learned. And here's some things we're thankful for. So that was my way of sort of addressing JL's concern that he wasn't learning clinical medicine. But I think underlying what he was saying, and frankly, the way I interpret it, was something even bigger. The idea of, well, if he's not learning anything from my elegant hyponatremia discussion, what else are my learners not learning that maybe I would like them to? And we could think of this as sort of the flip side of Fred Hafferty's hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum is supposed to be the implicit learning that occurs in academic medicine. But I'm more interested in what we're not learning. So one thing at the time that I started to think about word stories that I was really concerned about is my own work. And I work primarily at the VA, and I love my work. And I bring my daughter to my work and share it with her. But I'm not sure that I was sharing it and sharing my joy and that I take from my job with my learners. And so I thought maybe I need to be more intentional about that aspect of my job. And so the question is, why does that matter? I mean, there's so much that we have to teach. Why do I need to teach, that I love taking care of veterans, and why does that matter? And I think it comes back to this quote, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. We are really good at the what, and I do a monthly orientation with the residents and the students, and I go through the EMR, and I go through the policies, and I go through the structure rounds, and that's the what, and a lot of what we teach on the wards and medicine-wise is the what. But I think underlying it is the why. And in the talk where Simon Sinek highlighted this, he talked about Martin Luther King as someone who was wonderful at articulating the why. And he said, just think for a moment if Dr. King had gone on that stage and delivered a speech called "I Have a Plan." He said, I don't think we'd be talking about "I have a plan" today. One more metaphor or framework I want to share with you is something that the internist Jeff Weiss, who many of you would be familiar with, he's down at Tulane. He shared this with me. I know that he's fond of bringing this up at meetings, so maybe you've heard him talk about it too, but James Karst wrote this book in the 70s called Finite and Infinite Games, and it's quite a slog, but the gist of it is this, that most pursuits in life can be separated into finite and infinite games. And a finite game is something that I think you will all recognize. It's an exploit where we have a defined beginning and an end. We enter the game as role players, and when we're participating in a finite game, we're not actually playing as ourselves. We're playing roles. We're playing as abstractions of ourselves. The ultimate goal of a finite game would be to win. And in fact, the purpose of the rules exists solely so that we can say who has won, what is winning. And what's implied is that whatever is not prohibited in the rules is allowed. You know, actions are judged based on how close they get you to that goal of winning. And so, you know, if you haven't started thinking about them already, some examples would be sports, you know, semesters at college, clerkships in medical school, rotations in residency. And then when you get, you know, to be where many of us are, you know, it's awards, it's grants, it's publications. These are all examples of finite games. And finite games are fine. They're necessary. They help us get stuff done. But I think meaning in a finite game is limited. It's limited to you know, winning, and then you move on, and then it's the next game. Contrast that with an infinite game. So no boundaries. We get to be ourselves. The only goal is to keep going and to add more players to the game, in fact. And so these are the kinds of things that we really don't get recognized for. We don't get trophies for playing infinite games, but you see some examples at the bottom. I think that is where often the meaning lies and the satisfaction. So, you know, the question is, how do we change something? You know, for the med students, this is a clerkship. For the residents, this is a rotation, and they're all going to move on in a month, and they're going to be playing another finite game. So structurally, it's really working against us. I think, you know, two of the real keys are we have to devote, you know, dedicated time, protected time, and space. Call it headspace. Another word I like is a Japanese word called yutori, which we don't have a great translation for, but it's sort of like spaciousness or breathing room. It's, the example would be, you know, leaving early enough to get to your meeting so that when you get there, you have time to sort of look around before the meeting starts. So that's the kind of space I'm talking about. And it is hard to come by in clinical medicine, in academic medicine. So let me tell you what we came up with. So this is not going to sound groundbreaking, but basically what we did, we got the program director to give us one noon conference. And we do it at the end of every block. We catch the residents right before they switch, as well as the med students. Because it's a noon conference, our residents get lunch, and that's a big draw. It's also expected that they attend these things. That's where the time and space comes in, and I think the other factor that's important here is it's not only that we're making time and space for them, it's we're sending a message that this is something that we feel is important. This is an hour where we, the faculty, are going to be directing our attention towards this activity. Because I think residents in particular pay a lot of attention to their attendings, and they you know, they try to emulate us in terms of how we direct our attention. The second feature, I think, is it is an open invite. So yeah, the activity is focused towards students and residents, but I would say at least half of our ward attendings come at any given time. Probably half of our multidisciplinary team, so that would be our social workers, our case managers. And then finally, we do have a number of veteran staff members. Most of them are in administrative roles and program support, and they have come too. And we invite everybody. Again, everybody plays. And then finally, we have other activities in our residency program, one that I lead called Rounds for Reflection, where the reflection or the discussion is a lot more free-flowing. But this was something where we really wanted everyone to be involved. And so we thought we ought to give them questions, we ought to give them prompts, and we ought to make it a rule that everybody has to speak and has to answer them. And I think contrary to my, one of my initial concerns that could be intimidating, is it seems to actually level the barrier, the bar for entry. How do we come up with our questions? Well, I've thought a lot about this. Actually, there's a really good article in Annals a couple of years ago about the language we use when we speak with patients. And I really feel bad I could not find it, so I'm not giving appropriate credit. But this question was mentioned. It was a physician who said, I used to go around asking my patients at the end of rounds, do you have any questions? And nobody would ever answer. And then I changed the wording slightly to say, what questions do you have for me? And all of a sudden, the patient started speaking. So that's what I mean by open-ended and specific. I think we want them to do a little critical thinking. That is what reflection is, after all. And finally, I think they ought to be questions where they're gonna engender a range of responses. So here are the questions we've chosen, and I don't think that these are the only questions you could use, but they're the ones we have used this year. So we start with one thing you worried about before starting this rotation. We go around the room, everybody answers. Then we move on to something a patient said that made you laugh. Same format, everybody answers. Something a team member did that you admired. And then finally, one veteran from the month that you will never forget. I think there's specificity in these questions. I think there's also a little bit of critical thinking. But again, I think you could substitute your own questions easily. One of the things we wanted to do was use our questions to sort of focus attention and hopefully get some of these sort of more subtle messages across. We did a survey after every session. We did 12 sessions this year. Oh, excuse me. Before I get to the survey responses, just real quick, we do finish with a sort of a ritual where we honor the veterans who passed in any given month, and we invite the residents ahead of time to bring obituaries and read them. And I think ritual is another thing that we're really lacking in our profession, especially rituals to mark the passing of patients. And it turns out, at least from the feedback we've gotten, that this is something that people are really craving. So as I said, 12 sessions, 164 respondents. We only asked 2 questions, and it was free response. So over the next couple of slides, I'm just going to show you a sampling of the responses. I'm going to let you read them. I have not done any qualitative analysis of this, so we're going to take it at face value. So these are responses to what about this activity surprised you? And then this is a question about, how did this change the way you view your experience? All right, so I think some of the themes that seem to recur are, everyone did feel like participation was non-threatening and it was generally positive. People felt the activity built a sense of community. I think they left with a more of a sense of gratitude than they otherwise would have, and the idea that they're reconnecting with the meaning of their work. So, my take home points from this year, and we're certainly going to continue this. So residents really are craving this. I think you need the time and the space to make it effective. We have tried other interventions, retreats, and that kind of thing, but I think, those experiences pass quickly, and if you don't follow them up, if you don't make this some kind of regular part of the routine, then I don't think it's as effective. And then finally, using the prompts and questions, I think really did work for us. So, I would love it if some of you wanted to do similar things at your sites, and I'd be happy to talk about it now and later. So thank you.